Hey, Kit. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Let me see. Hmm, My face is a little white.
Yeah.
Let me close them. Uh,
There's this, but can you hear me?
Yes.
We sure can.
Okay. Everybody's here except Jim Dopp.
He just came in, so he'll be here in a sec.
All right.
And then, yeah, we've got a big agenda. So,
What we do.
Okay, everybody's on board, and I'd like to call to order this. Who's talking? I call to order this pre-meeting of the Budget Committee. Let the record reflect all members of the Budget Committee are on hand. And let's begin with Nina and the overview of the audit from last fiscal year.
before we jump to that, Nina's going to go over. We provided a couple staff reports for the first two items. So she'll just kind of quickly go over those. Hopefully, you've all had a chance to review those and answer any questions you might have. And then we'll jump into a presentation I have to cover the rest of the agenda items where I expect the bulk of our discussion to be. So if everyone's good with that, I hand it over to Nina to get us rolling.
Hey, could we just welcome Kit a little more formally?
yeah.
And hello.
All right.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome
My
aboard.
name is Kate Keating. I'm new, as you know.
Okay, that was on my list right over here, and if you don't look at the list, you don't notice it. So welcome aboard.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, Nina.
Good morning, everybody. So nice to see all of you here. So as you saw on Friday in the staff report, I provided an overview of the audit in a similar format to the quarterly budget committee meetings so that you guys could kind of have a bird's eye view of how we ended the year and sort of how we handled those issues that we noted in the audit in February's meeting. So first I wanted to see if anyone had any questions on that.
Hey, Nina, being new to this process, I think some of the citizens might not understand. Can you talk a little about our budget cycle as far as we start in June and go throughout the year? And what those quarters mean and et cetera?
We start July 1st to June 30th. And it can get kind of confusing when you think about revenue from short-term rentals because that goes based on a calendar year. So we still recognize all 4 quarters. It's just kind of mixed up a little differently. Does that answer the question?
Yep, I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page.
July 1st to June 30th.
Okay.
It's like more affectionately known as a fiscal year.
Fiscal year.
As opposed to a calendar year.
Then we start giving documents over to the auditors in August, and by the end of August, that's usually complete.
So the audit is complete, right? 21-22, the audit is all complete.
Yes, so that report that I included in the packet reflects the information from that audit. So the auditors are here at the end of August, and then generally by December, they're presenting the findings of the audit. We were a little late this year because we had some issues with the software conversion. We kind of had to suss through some stuff, but that's typical cycle.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Carry on.
Okay. So
Right as she drinks something, I say something.
do you see the dog on the cup? That's Poops.
Oh.
Okay, so the next item was the year-to-date finance report. So for those of you who are new joining, we provide a quarterly finance report and have these budget committees to sort of review that and look at where we're at with revenues and expenditures. So for this year, we're tracking pretty well with short-term rental revenue. We're expecting to be 23% down for this last quarter that will be included in the fiscal year. But overall, we're still, even without that quarter's revenue, 116% over budget. So we're tracking really well there. Some of you may have noticed the giant increase in earned interest. That fluctuates, and as I said in my staff report, is really difficult to gauge. So we still budget conservatively for that, but we have seen a nice boost this year, which is reflected in all of the departments. The other thing to note was the building permits, which were slightly down. And so that's reflected in the building department, but also in several other departments that I listed in the staff report because of the SDCs. Other than that, for expenditures, we're tracking really well, and we don't expect that we're going to need to do a transfer from contingency. Did I cover everything?
Deb,
On
I
the
think you're
report-
muted.
Can you hear me?
Thank you.
On-
I didn't hear
on
the last part. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Nina, I didn't hear the last part of what you said. A transfer from what?
We don't expect that we're going to need to transfer from contingency. So for those of you
Okay.
that don't know, we build in a line item in the budget for contingency, which
Okay.
we can by resolution transfer out to cover if we think we're going to overexpend in any areas.
Okay. Thank you.
And then Kit, did you have a question?
Yes, on the report here, you are provided the third quarter budget report comparing to the year-to-date actual as of March 31st, 2022. That is a good information to compare to this year. However, some information is missing. I just wonder if it is because of system conversion that you couldn't get it, or what it is.
No, so several meetings back, council expressed his desire to see the year-to-date from the previous year, but for revenues only. And so that's why, are you
Okay,
talking about
got
that last column? Yes, it's for revenues only. But if you had
Okay.
a question on anything specific, I could certainly pull that information. We just didn't want to bog down the report with a lot of information, so
Okay,
that's right.
that's fine. I just wondering, you know.
And then I don't know if you guys have any feedback on if the staff report was helpful. I know in the past I hadn't done that. So is there any information that you would like to see covered in it that wasn't, or did you find that to be helpful?
Staff report was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I like it. The my own information is just right to start.
Great.
And then like another option here is on the page in the third quarter review report, I think, if I didn't mess it up. It mentioned about a short-term rental license fees increase from 250 to 850. I wondered if this is per rental unit or per rental owner.
It's for each unit.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, it sounds like a big jump there. Probably is justified.
Yes, and then you'll see that reflected in the next year's budget, because as I said, in that staff report, those increases went into effect in November, and the majority of that revenue was received in July and August.
Okay.
You're muted, Catherine.
Dang it. Not a question, but a comment. If we were getting ready to go into the discussion about next year, which would bring up the question of forecasting, I'd want to have a little conversation about why we're off so significantly to the good. So that's always, if you're going to be off, it's best to be off to the good. But with such a higher number, so I think it kind of begs the question for next year, how we'll be approaching the forecasting. I'm kind of saying this, it's obvious if you kind of watch this, but I don't mind seeing the obvious thing every once in a while. So that'll bear some good scrutiny and some assumptions that'll be good to make clear and visible and transparent around occupancy trends we think are happening on the coast, whether we can continue to expect the kind of growth we've had, or if we're going to start to see that dip back, effect, if any, of the increased charges, things like that. So I'm sure that'll be included in our next quarter's, the discussion about forecasting for next year. So, correct, Layla?
Yes, yeah, we'll cover that towards the end of the presentation. And part of why we're doing that is I wanted to get the budget committee's feedback on the general assumptions that I'm projecting to use for this year's budget.
Thank you.
May I ask a question or make a suggestion? Since Kit was not in tune with the presentation made last year to raise license fees, I suggest it would be helpful to her, since she wasn't part of that, to send her that presentation on the justification for all of the increased fees. I mean, she asked whether it was justified, and so she may not have that information.
No, I haven't seen that. It'd be good if I can have the information, so I can catch up with the history. That would be good.
Mhm.
Good point.
Yeah, we can send you a link to that presentation. We'll send that out to the full budget committee. Folks want to remind themselves. But
May
just
I have
shortly,
one last? Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
we just for the record, so we just did a pretty exhaustive cost recovery study of what it takes for staff to issue those permits. And the presentation goes over that in detail.
Mhm. It's just a question. I'm just curious that on the third quarter budget report, City Hall expansion, there's an item here for budget $700,000 for surplus property. What is that? And then we have 0 on the actual. Can I get some
Great
information?
question. Yeah, absolutely. So we had estimated that we would actually sell the former City Hall last year, and we haven't sold it yet. So that number reflected what we anticipated in revenue for this year. So we just actually relisted the property and dropped the price. And we are not anticipating any funds coming in this fiscal year for that, but we are, cross fingers, anticipating revenue to come in next fiscal year. So that revenue will likely not show up in this year's budget.
Okay, that's $700,000 budget. Is it net of depreciation or gross?
That was what we had assumed would be net, was based on a much higher sales price than what it's listed for today.
Okay, all right, got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Layla, what is the fee that the broker will take on that sale?
5%.
Thank you.
Okay, next.
Okay. All right, ready to move on? Okay, I am going to share my screen. I hope I choose the right one here. Does everybody see that PowerPoint?
Yes.
Sorry, give me a moment here to get my screens oriented. All right. So, all right. So the agenda kind of covers what's actually on our agenda, but we're going to go over the professional services for the current fiscal year. I'm going to review our transfers, and I'll talk about what transfers are and give a little bit more detail and background, especially for the benefit of some folks that are new. And then I want to go over quickly kind of what the budget process overview is. I think all of you either have or did participate in the Department of Revenue, or at least the League of Oregon Cities budget training. So hopefully you have some sense of what you're in for. And then I wanted to give folks kind of an orientation to the budget itself in terms of the departments and funds, because it can, government accounting is sort of a different beast than private enterprise. And so I thought that would be helpful to just sort of refresh and also introduce kind of how our funds work. And then to kind of Catherine's point, I did want to go over just a few assumptions related to projected resources and requirements for the upcoming budget, so that when you do get the budget document, you have a bit of background in terms of where those numbers are coming from. So the first thing we did is, this was something that I don't think the city had done previously, but we are tracking our professional services by project now. But I do want to kind of clarify for folks what professional services are, because we've heard a lot of folks say that we have tons and tons of consultants. That's actually not factually true. And I want to highlight what kind of consultants we have, what services they provide, and what this line item really serves as. So it is the largest proposed expenditure for the department. It was in fiscal year 21-22, and I'm sorry, in 22-23, and it will be the largest line item in the administration's budget for 23-24. And I just want people to understand, both in the public and on this committee, what that line item is for. It's really a catch-all for our contract services that are necessary for city operations. And I'll talk through what those are. And then it also includes the resources to carry out many of the city council's policy goals. So the reason why folks saw a big jump from the 21-22 budget, which I didn't author, that was authored prior to my arrival. I shepherded it through the council approval, but I actually had nothing to do with the creation of that budget. The 22-23 budget, which I did create, included resources for implementation of city council goals. And so I'll talk through kind of the assumptions that I put into that number and walk you through where we are today in terms of those expenditures, and then where I project will be by the end of the year. I will note that other funds also have professional services in them as well, but their line items, they're not responsible for carrying out council goals. So those line items typically tend to be quite a bit less and are specific to contract services that are necessary for the operation of that fund or that department. So for last fiscal year, I estimated, and the budget committee and the city council approved, $450,000 in the professional services line item. And what this shows is a breakdown of what I estimated we would need. So when I talk about essential services, these are the contract services that are necessary for the city to operate. So we have a city attorney that's under contract, and I estimated $100,000 last year. Information technology, I actually upped the number last year to include, as I anticipated that we would be moving back into in-person meetings. So I estimated $50,000 for that. I estimated $50,000 for professional planning services. We now include our Cassell financial services software. That's a fee that we pay every month that allows us to use that software and provides us with the ability to get help from those folks. So that's an ongoing cost to the city. We estimated about $15,000 for the auditor. And then I usually like to include a little bit of contingency there, $10,000 for miscellaneous. So this is what I would consider to be essential services for the city to operate. We pay for the city attorney, it pays for our IT. We don't have a full-time planner on staff. And so that covers those sorts of services, our financing, our audit, and then if there are other things that come up. So those total essential services, and again, Let's all remember a budget is a plan and it's an estimate. So we don't often spend out this line item, but we do want to carry enough resources for unanticipated things, particularly when it comes to the city attorney and IT. So those total essential services I estimated were about $245,000. Then I did an estimate. My original estimate actually for the comprehensive plan update and outreach was $100,000. That was actually adjusted by the city council and changed to $150,000 during the budget process. Budget forward Manzanita. So these are the 3 goals that city council had set last year. I budgeted $45,000 for a revenue diversification study, which we're about to complete. And then I budgeted some resources to help level up our finances. And so this includes our financial consultant that has been invaluable to both Nina and I this budget, and has really, I think, helped us level up our game quite a lot. So the total council goals related items were $205,000. So that gets us to the $450,000 number. And so I do these estimates as part of my budget process. And so I'll be doing the same. Actually, I've already done the same for this year's budget. Does anybody have any questions about any of those contract services? So when we talk about consultants, these are the consultants that we have specific to the administration.
I had a question, Layla, under miscellaneous, I saw someplace that you had a $10,000 for grant writing support. Would that come under the miscellaneous there?
So you're referring to a separate fund, which is the City Hall Fund. And
okay.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor, but I do think you're referring to the budget for the City Hall project,
That's
which
right.
is
That's
completely separate from this.
Okay, so what would come under the miscellaneous? I'm just wondering.
That could be something like that. If we needed a grant writer to help us do, we had an opportunity to apply for a grant and we didn't have the capacity on staff, that would be something that we would use those funds for.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Okay,
actually
I
a
have a
great
question.
example of what a miscellaneous type of expense would be.
Okay, thank you.
Later on city attorney here, you have 100K budget there. Well, do you anticipate any lawsuits, anything that in process that we're going to spend this money? As I understand, this should be case by case budget. So, any known lawsuit in the process or maybe coming?
So it's a great question. So for last year's budget, we did anticipate that we would be addressing a appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals. So we incorporated that in here. I do think it's important that we have some measure of contingency in the city attorney line item. And I can show you, if you look at the budget report that Nina prepared from last year, you can see what we actually spent on attorney services. And I actually go through where we're at this fiscal year related to that. But I do like to have a little bit of padding in this line item in the event that something unanticipated does come up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. And just to be clear too, just because we budget for it, we operate, I would say this is true of all of my department heads and myself. We are very budget conscious. And so just because we have 100 grand doesn't mean we want to spend it all. We actually really try to get as under that number as we possibly can. But as you'll see, for example, this fiscal year, this was actually a pretty good starting point for us.
Okay.
So the actuals year to date, I want to thank Nina for working on a Sunday to help me pull this together to get you to exactly where we are at this very moment in time. We have spent nearly $80,000 this fiscal year on the city attorney. And that was because we did anticipate that potential additional legal services that were required. We've spent so far $32,500 on information technology. we're pretty low when it comes to professional planning services. So we've started allocating, there's 2 line items in our budget. There's one for professional services and there's one for planning and zoning. So I want to differentiate between the 2. The professional planning services are those that can't be attributed to a specific application. So this is the weekly staff meetings that we have with our planner. When I start planning for doing the comprehensive plan update, those resources will be allocated out of this line item. We have a planning and zoning line item in the budget for the administration that's specific to the application for which we actually charge a fee. So those tend to be recovered in terms of fees that come through our revenue. The financial software, we're up to 17,280. And I'll talk to you about what I expect will be towards the end of the year. The auditor was 13,500. We had a couple of miscellaneous expenditures. So our total essential services items spent to date is $150,000. The Envision Manzanita, the comprehensive plan update, we conducted a significant amount of outreach, but we have not yet started that project, largely due to other things coming up that held us back from doing that work. So expect to carry that over into next fiscal year. The budget forward, we did contract with Echo Northwest. It's in the process of completing our revenue diversification study. And then our finance contractor, we paid out $4,250. Where I expect we'll land by the end of the year is I am just projecting we'll hit that $100,000 mark with the city attorney, that we will hit our contract limit on information technology. I'm not expecting a huge amount more in planning services, but we are starting to gear up for a transportation system plan implementation. And so we'll be working with our consultant to start that work. We'll pay out the contract amount for our financial software. The auditor's fees are already fully paid. And then just an estimate of, if anything additional comes up, I wanted a little cushion in there. This is what we use to estimate what our beginning fund balance is. So I do like to be a little conservative, but it doesn't mean that we'll spend $5,000. We'll only spend $5,000 if we have to. I don't expect to spend any more money on the comprehensive plan update, other than potentially the planning services to get start drafting a scope of work for an RFP if I have capacity, which is not necessarily on the table at the moment. We will complete our contract with Echo Northwest, which was for $34,590. So that will be paid out this fiscal year. And then I do expect that we will use we will get to our contract amount to some extent on our finance contractor. So I'm estimating that we'll spend $242,000. And for the budget, I think I'm just putting in $250,000 just so that, again, being conservative in terms of what the beginning fund balance estimate will be for this coming fiscal year. Does that help kind of demystify and clarify and hopefully calm some minds about our consultants and the amount of money that we spend and what this professional services line item means? And do you have any other questions or concerns or comments related to that for me?
Leila, I do have a kind of a minor question, I think, and I don't need to go into the weeds on it, but on the city attorney, we obviously are using both James and Savani, and I'm just curious how that decision is made. Is there a hourly differential involved, and who determines which attorney is helping us out with what problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for those of you who are new, James Walker is officially the city attorney. James is a partner at Miller Nash, and his focus really is on real estate, government related contracts, and coordination with government. But everything we do kind of starts with James. Jerry mentioned Suvani. Suvani Miller is a land use attorney, and she's an associate, and their billing rates are about $100 difference. So one of the things that I worked with James on, and this actually has reflected in the amount of hours that were allocated to the Land Use Board of Appeals case that we were involved in. Suvani represented, I want to say 95% of the billable hours for that action or that activity. So she did the majority of that work and then would check in with partners who had a much higher billing rate. And that was something that James and I have been working on together, that when we can, we're using folks that have lower billing rates in order to help economize on our expenditures. So the determination of the who depends on the what. So one of the benefits that we have by having this group of attorneys is that we have a very large bench of folks that we can tap into based on subject matter expertise. So James tends to handle a lot of the things that are sort of general issues for us. So complicated records requests, things of that nature, contracting questions, sort of day-to-day operations. But we also updated our employee manual. So I worked with an attorney that James pointed me to on his team that is an employment attorney. And so, I know that our employee manual has been vetted by someone with that subject matter expertise. Suvani, she's a land use attorney. So she's involved in any of the questions we have related to land use. We had to do a number of contracts for the City Hall project, which those expenditures are reflected in the City Hall fund. They're not reflected here. And we had a contract expert who could help write and execute those contracts. Does that answer your question, Jerry?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you.
So,
And just
Leila, I have a couple of questions. First of all, on information technology, we have come to depend on that a lot, particularly with the meetings that we're having. You've reduced information technology, and I'm curious about why. And then secondly, on Level Up Manzanita Finance, can you talk a little bit about what that entails?
Sure. So I estimated 50,000. I am bound by contract in terms of what I can actually pay. So this represents the full expenditure of the contract that we have with our information technology professional. So it's not reduced. It's just I estimated 50,000, and where we landed contract-wise is here.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers that. The $10,000, this is our Grand Peaks consulting firm. So and we've been working with Bonnie Dennis, who is a GFOA, a government financial officer, 20 years of experience doing this work. Bonnie has helped. So the projection model that I'll be presenting to the budget was developed by Bonnie. She worked with me in depth to do the budget projections, the expenditures, to create a sophisticated model, a lot better than the one I did last year, because the stakes are really high this year in terms of understanding our financial position and to position the city council in terms of making an informed decision about whether or not to take on debt service should you decide to do that. So this is about, really getting our tools in place. So what this resulted in is a tool and a model that we have that we didn't have before. It also includes advising to both Nina and I, who are not certified government financial officers. And I believe it's in the best interest of the city to have that kind of subject matter expertise, given the nature and complexity of our budgets. So we rely on that. We expect that over time, that every year, I think Nina and I are both like, This budget has also been grueling and brutal, but it's a lot better than it was last year. And so part of this is leveling both her and I up, but the city as a whole. As you all know, or at least those of you who are more familiar with me, that one of the things that I am dedicated to doing for this city is creating long-term sustainability by creating tools, procedures, and policies that are transferable and can live beyond the staff that are here today. When you build an organization around a cult of personality and those personalities change, it becomes very difficult for the city to continue on its path. So as many of you know, last year was really hard for us. We had to teach ourselves a lot of things. And so what we're really trying to do by investing in these resources and leveling up, and I appreciate that council approved this as an ongoing goal, is to set the city up for success well after I'm gone and well after Nina's gone, which hopefully won't be for a while. But that's the point of having those. So a good example actually is that I wished we had Bonnie on board with us prior to the completion of the audit, because we learned some things through that process that had we known, we could have actually made some changes to that. So we learned that lesson the hard way. And next year, I think you're going to see a lot more sort of sophistication and clarity around that.
Thank you, Leila. That really makes sense. Thanks.
Great. Okay, to move on to the next, just a little bit more detail on what we spend money on. So in terms of that breakdown of what we've spent so far on the city attorney, just some examples of what general matters are. So what do I call the city attorney about? Land use matters. You know, I don't want to get into detail on some of these because some of them could have led to some issues for us. But if we get questions about particular land use matters and we need some advice, I'll reach out. A lot of issues related to short-term rentals. Some of you may remember Lincoln County had a recent decision related to short-term rentals. And so we wanted to better understand the implications for that. And we instituted a freeze. We needed some advice on what the legal risks were for us to implement a freeze. Procurement and contract reviews. I am really holding us to the letter as best I can in terms of how we do procurement and doing it appropriately. And then also contracts. The city needs to be in the driver's seat when we are working with contracts. And when I got here, we were, that was not the tack that we were taking. So we now, any contracts that we sign with outside parties are either created by the city attorney's office. So I currently now have a template for professional services agreements. We didn't have that before. So it costs money to develop that agreement, but now that I have it, it's a lot cheaper for us to go through and have them reviewed, so that when I sign a contract for the city, I am doing so knowing that I am doing it what's in the best interest of the city. Because oftentimes contracts that come from vendors are typically slated towards the vendor. And so this allows us to be a lot more, risk averse. I'm very risk averse. The employee handbook and policies, so those will be updated every year. We did a big update this year, so I see this as just being kind of maintenance going forward. We needed some guidance on how to implement the system development charges for the stormwater, for example. Any changes to ordinances or establishment of new ordinances. We're creating laws. We like lawyers to look at it so that you have confidence in what we're putting forward is legal and it's been reviewed. Things like changes to your council rules of procedure. We spent some cash on that this year, y'all. And then any other items that usually are approved by the city manager. I typically have the relationship with the city attorney, but city council can also ask the city attorney to do work with the majority of city council approval. Oftentimes that doesn't happen unless there's a reason for it to. But those items, if they come up and the council has a concern about that and feel, so an example would be things related to my contract. I shouldn't be talking to the city attorney about that. It makes sense for a member of council to be having that conversation with the city attorney But that means that member of council needs to get the approval of the majority of the city council to have those conversations. And the reason for that is because it is my responsibility to manage the budget. And so if individual councilors were reaching out and asking for things without going through that process, that can impact the city's budget in a way that makes it difficult for staff to track. And since it's my responsibility to track that, the council rules and procedures are very clear that that's what needs to happen. Specific matters. So just for folks who were wondering, we actually spent quite a bit of cash last year establishing a legal moratorium on dune grading. This reflects kind of the remainder of that work and then the renewal of that moratorium that council just passed, I believe, in March. The Land Use Board of Appeals for the Manzanita Hotel project so far cost the city close to $30,000 in legal fees. And to Jerry's point, if we had had a partner working on that, that number would be closer to 50.
Layla, when does the dune grading moratorium expire?
We renewed it for another 6 months, and we have the opportunity to continue to renew it until such time, as long as we're showing evidence of progress, that we have updated Goal 18 and the enabling ordinances that currently allow for dune grading. Okay. So that will be subject to workload and priority and our ability to advance the comprehensive plan.
May I ask a question here? The Land Use Board Appeals. It seems like the land use issues cost quite a bit of money of the city. Do we have some updates as how we are or where we are in the appeal or the legal matters there?
Yeah, so this went all the way up to, so this is a case that was an application that was denied by the Planning Commission. It was appealed to City Council. City Council upheld the Planning Commission's decision. The applicant appealed it to the Land Use Board of Appeals. It's gone through the Land Use Board of Appeals process and has been remanded back to the city. And we will be holding a hearing on that on May 15th. And it's TBD and really unknown what happens next. There will be additional evidence provided at that meeting. And there's just really no way to estimate what the outcome of that could be. So it's sort of a sit and wait kind of thing.
Is it particularly related to the hotel development?
That's right. Yes, it's the Manzanita Hotel project.
Yeah, because I've been hearing some rumors about that. I just don't know where we stand on that.
Well, the way to find out is if you can you can go to the Planning Commission's website, and there's a notice that's been posted on the Planning Commission's website that details out what the next steps are for the remand of that. And I would just advise anyone in the community who's hearing rumors that facts are the best way to be informed and to find that information. We do our best to provide that as soon as we have it. So that's been posted on the city's website since about 2 weeks ago. And there will be a Planning Commission hearing on May 15th to hear, it's basically one item that was remanded back to the city to be addressed. A staff report will be posted 1 week in advance of that hearing, which will include the staff analysis and findings for the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission will review the evidence presented and make their decision at that meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Sure. All right. So I'm going to keep moving. All right. So now we're on to review of transfers and summary of indirect cost allocations. So I just thought I'd define a couple of things. We have sort of two different types of transfers. is what we call an interfund transfer. So that's transfer from one fund to another fund for a specific purpose. And then we have what we call an indirect cost allocation, which is funding transferred from one fund to another for administrative functions that benefit from that fund. I know this is old hat for some of you, but why not just review it in the spirit of full transparency and get folks up to speed again with where we are. So just kind of remind folks, Manzanita has always paid for administrative services from the water utility, which is, and we'll talk about the different types of funds next, but the water utility is a for-profit enterprise fund. So the city provides administrative overhead services in the form of management, finance, city council support, etc. Once upon a time, and not too long ago, the way that this was recovered was actually as a percentage of the city manager's salary. So back in the 90s, the city manager paid themselves 25% of their salary directly out of the water. This increased to about 50% over time. And this is not uncommon for small cities. There's a handful, I think some were mentioned at our last budget committee meeting, that still use this methodology. But Manzanita moved away from that, I think it was 4 years ago, and in an effort to create a more transparent process, because there was no tracking of, where the 25% number came from. Nobody knows where the 50% number came from. There's really no backing to that. And so my predecessor made the decision to move towards a model that they hired a consultant to do, and using cost drivers to estimate indirect costs. Now, I think most all of you are familiar with indirect costs. And Kit, I know you have a very strong background in private financing, and so understand what those things are. And we did this through a number of open hearings and in a very public, transparent process. The city relied on this model for 4 years, but when I came in last year, we talked about this quite a lot during our process. The budget committee and the council supported moving forward with that model that FCS created for this current fiscal year. But it became very clear that it was hard. It was just not easy to intuit, and it was hard to explain. And the budget committee directed staff to start to explore some other options. So the budget committee recommended that we advance what we call a materials and services model. And that model is essentially saying that there is a nexus between the amount of money a fund spends and the amount of administrative overhead required to manage those expenditures. We held multiple conversations with the budget committee and city council, and the budget committee recommended, I would say the majority of the budget committee recommended approval to the city council to adopt a materials and services indirect cost model. The city council, the majority adopted Resolution 2301, adopting a materials and services methodology. And that methodology is what will be included in this year's budget. Best practice is the general fund should not be subsidizing a for-profit enterprise. The facts have been presented in multiple public hearings through objective analysis and through transparent and public process. The city has always accounted for some form of transfer, either through paying the city manager's salary directly, or more recently through a more transparent, understandable, and model-based approach. And I want to be very clear that this is specific to the water utility and includes the building fund, which is now its own separate special revenue fund, that those are just its best practice. There has been some discussion or some opinions that this is being done to pay for City Hall. And I want to be very clear that there is absolutely no connection between those two. And and I want to emphasize that, we would be doing this, and we have done this since the beginning. And so I think it's very important, if we want to operate on a factual basis, that there is no connection between those two things. That we would be recommending this irregardless of whether or not we were advancing a city hall project or not. And at this point, we're not decided if that city hall project is going to move forward. And I'm still recommending, as a best practice, that the for-profit entity pay for the services that are provided for by the administration. This is also critical if we are to get to the point of revenue diversification. And again, I cannot emphasize enough that we have always done this, whether or not it's been through paying the city manager their salary, or through what I think is a much more transparent and defensible model, which is based on an objective analysis of expenditures and the costs to oversee those departments. Does anybody have any questions for me about that?
Yeah, I have a question. When you say that you can use this indirect cost allocation process to come up with a number that you then transfer, do you always transfer the full amount, or is that left to your discretion? Or could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. In practice, we have always transferred the full amount. And when I go through the transfers, you'll see I actually have a couple of proposed changes for this year, but there are not changes to the transfer from the water fund. It is always within the discretion of the council to decide if they don't want to do that, if they want to subsidize the water utility. That is absolutely a decision the council could make. So my budget proposal will not make that recommendation. But again, so the process is set up the way that it is, that both the budget committee and the city council have discretion to make a different recommendation than that. This year's budget for the current fiscal year, it's already approved. So the last year, the budget committee and the city council unanimously approved those transfers, those indirect cost allocations. And I'm going to go through all of those transfers with you. We make them at the end of the year. And I'll explain why, in particular around one, revenue source. But yes, to be clear, that's what the budget process is for. The budget officer presents a proposal, and the proposal can be modified.
Perfect, thanks.
You bet. Okay, we'll go on. So the general fund, interfund transfers. So these are the transfers, again, I described are specific to a specific expenditure. So we'll be transferring out of the general fund $26,200 into the public safety equipment reserve. So this is what Chief Hart uses to budget for the purchase of new police vehicles. That gets held into a separate fund, and I'll talk about the different fund names shortly. That's what, and so we anticipate making that transfer in full this year. The general fund will be transferring out $5,000 into the storm drain fund. That was to support the Dorcas reconstruction project. There is a transfer scheduled out of the general fund into the building fund. You will not see a transfer like this again. And for those that are new, what this represents is the beginning fund balance for the building fund. The building department is actually, the building fund is actually a special revenue department. And prior to my arrival, the building fund resources, which are restricted by the state, were commingled with the general fund because the building department never made enough money to pay for itself. That changed when construction starts went through the roof. So we did an estimate of what we believed the building permit revenue was going to be from fiscal year 21-22 and proposed a transfer to seed what is now a separate special revenue fund. So all the resources that we get in from the building fund now go into the separate fund. And I'll talk about that. There's a little bit more to this story, and I'll get to that in a moment. We did a transfer out of the general fund into the road fund of $80,000. And that tends to be necessary because the road fund does not have enough dedicated resources to operate on its own. If you recall back to our presentation from Echo Northwest, we have a couple of options that would actually help offset this and dedicate revenue specific to the road fund, which would actually start to make the road fund itself sustainable and allow us to gain resources to start to build out some of our projects. But as I said last year in our last year's budget, the city's past practice has been to subsidize all of our system development charge funds and infrastructure funds with general funds. And I would argue that that is unsustainable, and it is also not a best practice. And so I've been working with the last council and this council to move us towards creating more sustainable sources of funding for infrastructure, which I know is a very important issue for all of you and for members of our community. But our past practice has been, we'll just let the general fund pay for it. And so my hope is that we will start to move away from that model and start to develop sustainable, reliable funding sources that can help us continue to and improve our ability to implement important capital projects. So the water utility and system development indirect cost transfers. So last year, the FCS methodology, the budget committee and the city council approved $168,350 to be transferred out of the water utility fund and into the general fund to pay for administrative overhead. And we are proposing to make that full transfer. There is also another transfer out of the water utility fund into the Public Works Equipment Reserve Fund. So the water utility puts money into the Public Works Equipment Fund so that they can buy equipment specific to the water system. We also had planned a transfer out of $44,265 for the water SDC fund to cover the administrative costs related to the Dorcas reconstruction project. That project kicked off a lot later than we had anticipated. Our new methodology does not necessarily account for transfers from an SDC fund. And because we have a significant amount of water construction projects, I am electing to not make that transfer this year out of the water SDC fund. And so the budget that you'll receive will reflect this, but that's specific to the water SDC fund. An SDC fund, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is specifically related to capital expenditures, which is very different than the water utility fund, which is a revenue generating fund and requires a significant amount more overhead than the SDC fund. So to me, it seems like this would be a clean way to do it. And I'm fully comfortable with making that decision. Does anybody have any questions about this? Okay. Building indirect cost and road interfund transfers. So we had originally, again, using the FCS model, had an approved indirect cost transfer because we also provide administrative services to the building fund, which is a separate, also revenue generating fund. And that number was $55,570. And I'm proposing to transfer $3,711. And I'm going to break down the math for you on the next slide as to why. The building fund will be transferring out $12,500 into the building fund equipment reserve fund. So again, purchase of equipment, capital equipment for the building fund itself. And then the road fund, we propose a transfer out of the road fund into the public works equipment reserve fund to buy equipment specific to the road. So why only $3,700? Well, we have to make estimates when we are preparing a budget. And then those estimates are backed up by actuals at the end of the fiscal year. So the total building revenue that we actually received in fiscal year 21-22 was $426,000, roughly. We took that. I started with a bit lower number. The estimate that I had based on my conversations with the building official was a bit less than that. So we subtract from that the actual building expenses that were incurred in fiscal year 21-22, which leaves what should have been the beginning fund balance based on the actuals of $320,474. So to make it right, and if you've ever worked with a building official, they watch every penny, which you love them for that. So we had estimated the beginning fund balance. So if you recall back to that transfer I described previously from the general fund to initiate the building fund, if you subtract that from the actual revenue that was generated, there's a delta of $51,859. We were anticipating indirect cost transfer back to the general fund for overhead services of $55,570. So I'm proposing the building fund transfer only be $3,711 to balance the beginning fund balance for the building fund, so that the building fund, those restricted funds are actually now based on the actuals. This will be the last time that we have to deal with this. Going forward, we will only be doing the indirect cost transfer from the building fund to the general fund. But this was our way of making the beginning fund balance for the building fund reflect the actual resources that we received, which were higher than we had anticipated. Does that make sense to folks? Okay. So in short, those are the transfers that we will be making. Nina will start working on those probably in the next couple of weeks. And then when you get your final reports, you'll start to see those numbers. We send, just so folks know, council gets monthly reports from us. Those have shown up as 0 because we haven't made the transfers. So we'll do that before the end of the fiscal year. But I wanted to share that with the budget committee first, and I will make a habit of doing this at our pre-budget hearings, at least as long as I'm here. Does anyone have any questions about the transfers? Looks like we're doing good on time. Okay, on to the next. So, just a quick, oh, sorry. Just ignore some of this stuff down here. We kind of have 4, my slide didn't update, I'm a little embarrassed. So we have a pre-meeting, that's what we're doing today. Our first budget meeting, which will be on the 8th at 4 p.m. is where you will receive the budget message. We will go through the general fund revenue, administration, public safety, court, parks, and non-department. So we're going to get through those funds. Budget committee too, this was a template, I'm so embarrassed, but this should say the remaining funds. We'll start with the water utility fund, the water construction fund, and the SDC funds, the building fund, and then all of our other remaining funds. On the 17th, we will have our public hearing where the budget committee will approve revenue sharing and make a recommendation to the budget, to the city council for approval. And then on June 14th is when the city council will ultimately adopt all of the budget resolutions, and the budget is officially adopted on the 14th of June. Does anyone have any questions about that? I just want to move past the slide because I was embarrassed it was wrong. That's what happens when you work late to a Sunday. You sort of see words and you think you already typed them. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the fund structure and definitions behind those funds, because we have funds and departments and some of them mix. But just so folks understand kind of the differences, I know this might be old hat for some of you, but it's always good to review. This is also something we include in our budget document. So the general fund is the fund that's used to account for most of our fiscal activities, except those activities that are required to be accounted for in another fund. So the general fund is really the big fund, and has been primarily the main fund that the city has used to pay for everything. Even if we've had separate funds, we've had a very strong practice of just transferring general fund money into utilities. And folks know it's best practice. If it's your utility, the utility should be paying for itself. An enterprise fund is a fund that's established to account for operations that are financed and operated in a manner similar to private business enterprises, and they're typically self-supporting. Our only enterprise fund is the water. We called it the water operations. I'm going to start calling it the water utility fund because that's what it is. So the water utility fund is here, and I have a slide that breaks that down next. A special revenue fund, which the city has previously called just special funds, but it's actually a special revenue fund. And that is a fund that accounts for the proceeds of a specific revenue source that is legally restricted to expenditures for specific purposes. So the building fund being one of those. We have capital project funds. Those are funds used to account for resources for major capital item purchases or constructions. So the system development charge funds are these. And then we have reserve funds, and those are funds that are established to accumulate money year over year for a specific purchase, such as new equipment. So the general fund is the general fund. The enterprise fund, the only fund that we have as an enterprise fund, is the water utility fund. If we say ran the wastewater fund, wastewater system here, that would fall under this category. But we don't. So that's Nehalem Bay Wastewater does that as a special district. Special revenue funds, we currently have 6. If I have my way, we will have 4 eventually, but that's currently the building fund. So those are state restricted funds. We have the road fund. So we have things like gas tax and other things that go into those funds, and those are restricted for that special purpose. The tourism promotion and facilities funds. So those of you that are aware, we collect a 9% transient lodging tax. 7% of that 9% goes into the general fund. So 100% of that. Of the other 2%, 70% of that 2% is designated to go into the tourism promotion and facilities fund, and there are specific requirements for those expenditures. And the remaining 30% goes into the general fund. We have a timber management fund. The city owns a whole bunch of land that we occasionally log, usually every decade or 2. The most recent logging, I think, happened about 3 years ago, and those funds were transferred in to seed the City Hall Fund, the City Hall Expansion Fund. We have what's called a Housing Rehabilitation Loan Fund. And this is a fund that I don't believe I'm going to be able to propose that we close this year, but I'm anticipating doing it next year. It was established in 1998. It is a loan fund that we had a third party that was administering low interest loans to folks that want lower income folks that wanted to upgrade their home. We haven't used this fund, as far as I can tell, in decades. And so I've reached out to the county to find out where we can return these funds to. Every city that received these funds returned them decades ago. We held on to them. And so it's just a fund that we have to keep bringing forward every year. We don't administer loans. We don't have the capacity to administer loans. I've reached out to the third party multiple times to try to find out if we even still have a contract with them to do it. At this point, it's just going to remain as it has in this upcoming budget. But next year, I'm going to likely, if I can't find out where this goes, recommend that it be transferred into the general fund, and then we close the housing rehabilitation loan fund. And if we have to repay it back to, it's a CDBG, so Community Development Block Grant, then we can do that then. And I've worked with our financial consultant, and that was the direction that she gave me to do that, because we're just carrying these funds that don't serve any purpose. Last year, the budget committee agreed to close the trust fund. So this was the place that we took in donations and expended them. We haven't used the fund in many, many years. I just didn't take the necessary steps to do that. So this year's budget will actually include a transfer. I think there's about just shy of $4,000 in that fund. And again, we have to audit and track all of this. I'm going to recommend that those funds be transferred into the Tourism Promotion Fund to help offset the costs that we are now incurring to help provide insurance. And we actually provided a significant amount of support to the 4th of July volunteers to set up a website for which they could take donations. So that's going to be my recommendation, is to transfer those funds into the Tourism Promotion Fund and close the trust fund. And that will have to happen by resolution. We have 4 capital project funds. So we have our
Can
water.
I ask a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
About special
Sure.
revenue funds. I just want to have a clarification here. Since the special revenue fund is some dedicated, fund revenue that is used for just some special purpose project, authorized project, then does it mean that the fund cannot be transferred out, like to pay for some indirect costs?
So your question is, can the funds cannot be paid out for indirect costs?
Yes. If let's say a city manager work on the special revenue fund, but then do we transfer any indirect costs from a special revenue fund?
We have not, but our model that we put together does provide a number for which we could do that. The revenue funds that we have, so we do that for the building fund. So we do an indirect cost transfer for the building fund. We do not do it for the road fund because we subsidize the road fund through the general fund. So we'd be kind of transferring money that we end up transferring back. That may change over time if the road fund becomes self-sufficient.
Is it by regulation that we don't transfer from the special revenue fund, or is it just not a regulation? I don't quite understand that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the goals I have for next year is developing a series of financial policies that would help clarify that. So historically, Kit, the city did not do transfers from special revenue funds. I proposed the first transfer from the building fund because of the amount of overhead that we provide. The reason, again, why we didn't do it, short of having a policy, the road fund, is because, again, it's subsidized by the general fund. I will talk about how we address those costs with the Tourism Promotion and Facilities Fund. It's a little trickier, but we are now paying for certain services that direct services that the city provides that can be attributed to the Tourism Promotion Facilities Fund. There have been no indirect transfers from the Timber Management Fund because that's typically a one-time chop down a bunch of trees and then we transfer the money. So there hasn't been a whole lot of activity to justify a transfer.
It's an area that we could look into.
Absolutely. And it's my hope that we will. Chip, you had a question?
Yeah,
Thanks for raising your hand too. It's so civilized.
So I think it's helpful to remember, we sometimes forget, for example, Kit, the Tourism Promotion and Facilities Fund would not exist except for the limitations that state law places on some of the transit lodging tax revenue. Back in, I think it was 2013, correct me if I'm wrong, or 2003, state law changed so that a tourism lodging tax imposed after that date must be split 70-30, 70% to go into, to be spent only on tourism and facilities, tourism promotion and facilities. So these are state law limitations. It's not something we can play around with. Another example is the building fund. The revenue from certain charges that the building fund gets from developers or homeowners are restricted by state law as to how they can be used and sometimes how much can be charged. So it's, once again, a matter of state law, not our own discretion about how those funds are used. On the other hand, the road fund is funded by the general fund. And so the purpose of the indirect cost methodology is to get funds that are utilizing administrative services to transfer the cost of those administrative services into the general fund. Since the road fund already is funded by the general fund, as Layla was trying to explain, you take general funds, put them into the road fund, and then take an indirect cost chunk of that and put it back in the road fund. It makes no sense. So until the the road fund, should it be ever self-sustaining because of a new tax that we've discussed under the revenue diversification initiative, then it would be a different story. So it's, I'm sympathetic to Kit because all of these funds and the limitations on them are quite confusing to someone who is coming to it for the first time.
So, in other words, the bottom line is all the funds in this special revenue fund category is varied, fund by fund. So there's no one policy to govern it. It's just different, right?
Yeah.
And then it's a little bit confusing as a newcomer like me. I need to learn on that. Thank you for your clarification, Chip.
Yeah. I think it's confusing even if you've been around it for a little bit. But it's a great question. So thanks. And just also folks, just jump in if you do have questions. Raise your hand or just holler. So I think I covered it. We have capital project funds. So those are the system development charge funds for water, storm drain, and parks. Those are specific to capital expenditures. And then the City Hall Expansion Fund, that is also specific to the construction of a City Hall facility. And then we have 3 reserve funds. So Public Works, as I mentioned, those are for big capital expenditures related to running the Public Works Department. Public safety, again, this is mostly focused on police vehicles. And then the Building Reserve Fund is also for typically vehicles or large capital expenditures. It ends up being, it's helpful for us to have these funds separately because then we can track how much money we have for purchasing those types of equipment. Excuse me. Okay. Any other questions before I move on? I think we're doing good on time. Okay. So you have fund structure, and then there are budgets within each of these funds that are departments, just to make it more confusing. So I'm going to work my way back. So reserve funds, you will see in your budget document a budget for the Public Works Reserve Fund, a budget for the Public Safety Reserve Fund, and a budget for the building. All right, the building fund. So this will show, here's how much revenue we have. Here's what the department head and the budget officer recommend for expenditures, and then what's left over. The capital project funds, the water SDC, you'll have there'll be a separate budget for that. A separate budget for the storm drain fund, a separate budget for the parks SDC fund, not to be confused with the parks department, and then the city hall expansion fund. So there'll be separate budgets for each of those, which will show revenue and expenditures. And just as a reminder, I think everybody knows Oregon requires balanced budgets. So we have to allocate every penny from revenue to our expenditures. The special revenue fund, that's where the building department is. So the building fund is actually its own separate fund. The tourism promotion and facilities fund has its own budget. The timber management fund has its own budget. The housing rehabilitation loan fund also has its own budget. And the trust fund, even though we plan to close it this year, we still have to propose a budget for that shows the transfer of the money out of that fund to zero it out. And then by resolution, we would close that fund so that it would not appear in fiscal year 25. The enterprise fund is where the water utility lives. And general fund, it's like I'm missing parks, but the administration department, the public safety department, the court department, what we call non-department, which is where the contingencies and transfers lie, and then the parks department live here. And then we have something called the civic improvement department, which was included in your memorandum from Nina, that I am proposing that we close that department this year. That department was set up. I attached a couple of resolutions to your packet. And there's probably folks here that have been on the budget committee a lot longer than me, but it has not served its purpose for a very long time. And what it has done is become a bit of an accounting nightmare for us. So there's a certain amount of money. We have anything above $50 that's in our business license renewal, and then $150 of the annual short-term rental fee are reserved for this department. That money has been just simply used as a pass-through department to capital project funds. So we're reserving, I think it's roughly like $60,000 a year that are reserved for the civic improvement. And then we have to budget for it in that department, but it's still general fund money. And then it just gets siphoned off into typically the road or the SDC fund. It is an accounting nightmare for us. And the last 2 years I have struggled with it. It has again not served its purpose. And so one of my recommendations, again, it's a recommendation, the budget committee can think otherwise and say otherwise, but is to kill that fund. Kill that department. It is not a fund, it's a department. And we are still, as you saw in our transfers, we transferred over $185,000 from the general fund to these capital project funds. It is my goal to make our budget more understandable, more reflective of where we are today. And so I think hanging on to vestiges of the past that don't really reflect where we are is not helpful. And so I'm strongly recommending that we eliminate that department and simplify our accounting. And I think that will also increase transparency in terms of how these funds are accounted for. And I want to pause for a minute and see if maybe any members of the budget committee or the council who have brought these questions up in the past, if there's any concerns about this. Again, it'll be a proposal. If the budget committee and council want to see this fund remain, then that is certainly your call. Okay. Barring no objections. All right, so now we kind of have the org structure. So we have these funds, but we're also not set up by funds, we're set up by organization. So you'll see this in your budget document, but I want to talk a little bit about the organization of the city. So the administrations department includes the Office of the City Manager, which provides oversight for everything. So I oversee the Tourism and Promotions and Visitor Center contracts. I oversee the Public Works Department. I oversee the Public Safety Department. I oversee the Development Services Department. So I'm responsible for all of them. We manage all departments and funds. So we're responsible for, ultimately the buck stops here. I'm responsible for making sure that those budget reports are in line with our spending. Nina is a huge part of that. So we manage the entire city's budget, including all of the funds. Our department heads, it's a new procedure that Nina put into place this year, has them review their specific funds that they're responsible for every month. So we meet monthly to make sure we're all on the same page. Our department also includes the Office of the City Recorder, it's also me. And so we maintain all the records, we respond to records requests, all the public information, and there's a lot of responsibilities that go into maintaining public records. We also provide the finance division. So that's really headed up by Nina and myself. And we provide services to all departments. There's not one department that issues a bill or expends $1 and it does not go through Nina, and I review pretty much everything that comes through here too. We also provide human resources services for all the departments. So that's just important. I'm kind of the HR director, as it were. Nina could be my assistant HR director. We wear lots of hats. I also serve as the planning director. So I am kind of the last person that reviews, for example, all of the planning information or planning stuff that goes to Planning Commission. And that ultimately falls on me. So I oversee the Development Services Department as well. And then again, manages contracts for all of the visitor center. And I'm sure I left off a bunch of other stuff, but that's what we do. We do it all. And our department also, through me, implements all the city council goals. And so that's 100% on my book. Public safety. So the Public Safety Department does what they do. They provide public safety, but they've also now taken on our new code enforcement position. The majority of that position is actually paid for out of the Tourism Promotion Fund. 75% is what we're proposing. But they will be reporting to our new police sergeant. So that department is managed by Eric Hart, who's our chief of police. Public Works. So Public Works, who's headed up by our Public Works Director, Dan Weitzel. They provide the day-to-day operations primarily. Their primary job is the water utility. They're also responsible for the roads, the parks, the storm drain, and they also provide tourism facility maintenance. So the Public Works Department is paid out of about 5 different funds. The majority is paid out of the Water Utility Fund, but there's also funding that comes from the Road Fund, from the General Fund Parks Department. They execute all of the system development charge related construction projects. And then some of their staff is paid out of the tourism promotion fund because they maintain those facilities. So that's how those folks work. Development services includes the building department. It's where all of the planning and land use applications start. And we also house our short-term rental program manager and our inspections out of that department. So that department is funded by the building fund for activities specific to the building fund. So for example, 70% of our building officials' pay comes out of the building fund, 30% comes out of the general fund. We have a planning and permit tech. It's a 50-50 split between the general fund and the building fund because he does stuff specific to the building fund. And then anything outside of that is covered by the general fund. And then the general fund pays for a short-term rental program manager. Just to make it more complicated for you. So that's kind of the end of that part of the presentation. Just want to pause for a moment and see if anybody has any questions. And this is all spelled out in the budget book too.
Has Eric named his sergeant yet?
No.
Okay.
Working on it.
Layla, will this presentation be available online?
Yes, absolutely. We'll post it when we're done today. I just didn't finish it till like 10 last night. So
Thank you.
Yeah. And I wasn't procrastinating. There's more work than there are hours in the day. Okay.
It's a lot
Any
of
other?
work. I know.
Yeah,
It's a lot of work.
it is. It's like carved out under my eyes right now. Is there anything else on this that y'all want to cover? Or you feel more educated on that? Okay. All right. So, revenue. I just wanted to go over some big picture stuff. And if you have questions or comments or anything about any of it, let's talk. Well, this is the time. But the big ticket item here is transient lodging tax. So we've been doing some outreach to folks that, one of the things about our short-term rental program manager, Judy Wilson, she's kind of a legend, but she knows everybody. And she's a great resource for staff. And for me, when looking at this, and we are starting to see a decline, not a significant decline, but certainly a decline in revenue. One of the things that I think Catherine pointed out is that for the last 2 years, we have received revenue almost twice to what we had, maybe not twice, but significantly higher than what we had estimated. And that's been great because it's helped build up our coffers, but from a budgeting standpoint, I think we need to get a little closer to reality. And so I called around to a number of folks in our region to learn kind of what their trends are. Tillamook County, for example, has not seen a decline in TLT. We've actually seen a slight increase. As Nina mentioned, this last quarter, we're anticipating a decrease due to the weather, but it's usually one of our smaller quarters in terms of revenue. So we don't expect it to have a significant impact. What I am going, our average rate of growth prior to COVID was just up about, between, I think it was something 11.8% is what we looked at. And so what I did is I looked at where we were in 2018, pre-COVID, and what our growth would have been, because COVID, we were just sort of like steadily increasing about 10% a year. And then COVID hit, and we actually saw a drop because we closed, literally closed down all of our short-term rentals. And then we saw this just huge jump. And I've been working with our financial consultant on this as well. And so what I'm proposing is I began with the 2018 pre-COVID numbers and estimated a 10% increase each year to get us to a number. And that number is significantly less than what we're anticipating for this fiscal year, by the tune of almost $300,000 less. And so I feel like that's a conservative estimate, but it's probably less extreme conservative than we've been in the past. So, and I think that that's more appropriate as we start to consider potential expenditures in terms of infrastructure in City Hall. We should try to be tracking a little bit closer to reality, but still embodying our philosophy of underestimating revenue and overestimating to some extent expenditures. But that delta was really big before, and so we're just trying to get it a little bit closer to reality by maintaining that. So that's kind of high level what I'm proposing for the TLT, which is super variable. It's like trying to read the tea leaves. So I'd love any feedback folks might have on that. Chip?
You actually, I have the same, I thought about that maybe last night in my dream. But anyway, I have thought about how to, budget for it to make it closer to reality. And I actually have the same thought, like your approach. We forget about the 2 years when the COVID situation, because it's just not normal. And then we start from pre-COVID and then estimate and then look at the pre-COVID increase and add on to from 2018, 10%, or I would do maybe 12%, because as you see, it's growing a little bit more every year. 10 may be a little conservative. So growth from 2018, 2019, 2021, just ignore the data that we have in the COVID years. So that's what I would do, and you are doing is actually what I thought. So I think it's a good job and good thinking, in my opinion. And then you can match the expenditure, when you have a revenue based estimate, then you can calculate the expenditure according to the historical data. I think it's a good starting point.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. One is, what is the period over which the 11.8% average growth was calculated?
The 5 years prior to COVID.
So it's 2013, just roughly into 2018, somewhere in there. Mm-hmm. And so when the other question is, you said you expect that's going to come in for the next budget period, 23-24, at $300,000 less than you expect for the current fiscal year?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I think that's, as Kit suggested, that's certainly worth some discussion, meaning we can probably all agree with regarding the COVID period as an anomaly, and then what the rate should be assuming going forward is up for discussion. I agree with you that we should be conservative as we have in the past. The only concern I have is, and this is a response in a sense to Kit. My guess is that 12% might be a little bit too aggressive, because as Kit said, it was an anomaly, those 2 years, and we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. However, we have seen continual growth in visitor and visits. And so on the other hand, are people going to stop coming all of a sudden? I think I'm just wondering whether there's some medium between 10 and 12 that would make more sense while still being conservative.
Don't forget the fact of the inflation. And then I'm pretty sure that compared to years, to 5 years ago, the inflation rate in the nightly rate of average unit has been up at least 10%. So,
so I'm wondering, what about if the staff gave us a comparison of 10, 11, and 12, and how those expectations for 23, 24 compare to the expected revenue for fiscal 23, so that we at least have some idea of the range of conservatism or aggressiveness in those projections.
Yeah, I can, so what I can do is, what I propose is, I'd like to propose the budget with that more conservative rate. And then I can, as part of the budget process, because I'm starting to like have a panic attack about the math, because it changes everything in the budget. That we can, I can bring you what that revenue projection would be if we had increased it by 11 and 12%. I should also note that for the 5-year projections, I'm being really conservative, like even more conservative on those, and only estimating, I think, 4% growth moving forward, just because we don't know.
Okay, Layla, I don't have a problem presenting the budget with the 10% assumption, but for a sensitivity analysis, we would at least know, don't change the budget, but give us some idea of what the different revenue difference would be between 11 and 12, so that we at least say, my suspicion is that 12 is too aggressive. But I'd like to know what it is.
Yeah, and so I did do some of that, since I obviously did some of that sensitivity analysis prior to landing on that 10%. And it makes, a couple $100,000 difference every, at this fiscal year. So if you increase it to 12%, we start getting closer to, we get to a much higher number. And that number just didn't, again, it's like reading the tea leaves, but based on what I was hearing from neighboring communities, I reached out to 3 or 4 of our neighboring communities in the county, that I wasn't super comfortable putting that forward, particularly in a year that you're going to be looking at our revenue and determining if you feel like we have sufficient resources to sustain debt service. It felt like having a more conservative estimate would allow us to make a better decision about whether we can afford new debt service. So that honestly was part of my thinking too, is like, what's realistic and conservative? Because I think if the council, when I'm done with the projections, that we're not trying to paint too rosy of a picture, that I'm trying to paint something that's like close to reality, but a little less, just to give ourselves a little bit of, again, conservatism in making that decision. So that was important to me, to do that. So that was part of the thinking, although I totally hear what you're saying.
I think we can just go with whatever the budget is right now, and then, along the way, we can, still
Totally.
discuss on it. I know you put in a lot of work on the draft of the budget. Let's
Yeah.
go with it, I think, and then we will, study a little more. Like I said, it's just my first time,
Yeah.
I
That was great feedback.
whatever I feel like that in my expertise that may be, helpful, but let's stay with your draft and then let's go on forward and then maybe get a little more data or, along the way and see what the actual data come in.
Great. Yeah, it's great feedback, and it's really helpful to have your perspective on that, because it's one of the more important aspects of our budget process. Is we want to have these assumptions. I mean, we're really kind of making informed guesstimates of what the future will bring. So I deeply value the feedback, and certainly between now and then, if you have other thoughts, let me know. But like I said, I bring a proposal, and it's definitely the prerogative of the budget committee and the council to amend those. It's a team effort, Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. This is an interesting discussion, and I appreciate the input from everybody thus far. You will see how it all plays out, right? How much is hanging on the difference between 10%, 11%, 12%. I agree with the idea of being conservative about projections, especially as it relates to, well, always, but especially as it relates to debt service and the big decisions that are coming up for the city. We've never gone wrong being conservative about these numbers. And I can remember sitting at the beginning of COVID, and I think that was my very first, might have been my first or second budget meeting. And our city manager then, Cynthia, came in, and the number I really wanted to hear more than anything is, what the heck is she going to project for STR? We were in lockdown, and nobody on the planet, I think it's fair to say, really knew what was going to happen. And she came in, I think the number was 80%. She came in with an 80% of, not a drop of 80%, but from 100 to 80%. Yeah, reduction. And I remember thinking, wow, I'm not sure, is that enough? I mean, I was honestly worried at that point, were we going to be able to carry staff? What the heck was going to happen? So the amount of uncertainty we're facing now is far, 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 how many times can I say far less than what we were doing then. And it makes the conversation then, we're able to, I think a little more in detail about it. And this is, again, it's not rocket science, but I mean, this money is dependent on the number of units that are available, the number of nights those units are occupied, and the price that the owner of those units is charging, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. That gets to our revenue stream. And I'm glad you've taken into account the expertise and the forecasting, of the regions around us, because we have, there's questions about this number. We've got to freeze, at least we've got to freeze a cap on the number of rentals that we have now. And we don't know how far out in time we'll carry that, or if that'll change. There's a behavior shift, that's happened with how people travel, and people wanting to travel intact with their family, and hotels being maybe less desirable for some people, and homes to rent are being more desirable. And then, as Kit mentioned, there's this price question of, with inflation and with just how much will the market bear, what are the owners of the rentals going to do? How and when might we still see a big increase in revenue simply because people see an opportunity to increase price? And we've got a lot of volatility going on around us in terms of regulations for short-term rentals and concern about them in their communities. So it's one thing for sure is we won't be right. Forecasting works that way. but it's important that we get it in a good ballpark for the decisions that we're making this year, as always. So it'll be good, and I don't know if this will fit well for our budget committee meetings when you're giving the presentation or the proposal and we see the revenue numbers and see the costs, but it'd be interesting to understand a little bit more what's gone into the forecast of 10%. So what's shifting there? Is it occupancy? Is it pricing? Is it both? And that, this whole process is progress, not perfection, right? And I've been also thinking, I'll just say it before we get to the end, of the light years that we have traveled, at least from the time I've been on the budget committee, and I'm sure every year has been progress, but the presentation, the thought that goes into this, the analysis that's in this and is very clear in this presentation is literally light years. You built on what was there before. Everybody worked hard and did their best, but this is considerably better and considerably clearer for people. I think in terms of the public and folks in general who don't spend and really don't want to spend a lot of time understanding all the details, what it means is, because this is not everybody's goal in life to be a budget for the city. We certainly have a few people who that's a goal and they go for it, but most people not so much. So getting some of this discussion good discussion we've had today into some really clear points that are understandable and trying to simplify some of the things that we've discussed today will be good as we get into the public meetings and the good exchange that we should have with people who've got questions about this. So that's it. So
yeah, that's great feedback. Thank you. And one of the things I'd like to do when the projections are in the budget, what I did similar to last year is I'll have some key assumptions that are highlighted from the work paper that was developed as part of this. And the real variables are both the transient lodging tax and then the other one I wanted to hit on, which is fees for service. I want to give a big high five to staff, particularly Scott Gebhardt and Judy Wilson, who have really worked hard to make sure that the services that we provide, the fees for services, are actually matching cost recovery. And so we've made some adjustments to short-term rental fees, which I know it's a bit controversial, but we got a 5-0 vote on that, and that's in place. That's actually going to have a very positive impact on our revenue. The inspection fees, we implemented some technology fees. So a lot of these kinds of services and procedures we're putting into place, we're finding ways, so staff has been helping diversify revenue. So you'll see actually a pretty significant change in those estimates, which are also, I'm estimating conservatively. But you will see a change from previous years in terms of those fees for service that now reflect cost recovery. But those are the two real pieces of our revenue that are the ones that are the most squirrely, but that we rely on quite a lot. And fees for service, as we learned through our revenue diversification studies, should be a larger portion of our revenue. So I just want to commend staff for really taking the lead on that. And we're also updating our master fee schedule right now, because we do things for free that we really should be charging for, especially those things related to new development. So those are things that when I go through the revenue portion of the budget, I'll be sharing that, and those will be included in the budget document itself. Two other quick things I wanted to hit were the water utilities. So the water utilities, since we haven't adopted officially a new rate, that the revenue projections for the water utility are reflecting our current rates. And so I anticipate that we will get more water revenue for the utility than what we are budgeting for, but it seems the most appropriate at this point to estimate what we know rather than what we hope for. So I think we can just all expect that the water utility revenue projections will be lower, quite a bit lower than what I anticipate we will receive. I do hope and expect that we will adopt new rates in June. It could be July, but I just wanted folks to know that for this fiscal year, because that's where we are today, and have to have a budget document ready next week, that's what we're going to be estimating. And the other thing too is that we do anticipate doing an increased permit fees to account for inflation. Whether that makes it into this year's budget is still TBD, but just something to think about, that we'll probably get more revenue than we expect in terms of those fees. But overall, we are expecting revenue to be significantly lower than the last 2 years for both the building, not both, but for the building department and for our SDC funds, because they're related, obviously. So housing starts have slowed down. They are actually quite a bit lower than we had actually anticipated this year. So we are budgeting conservatively for those revenues. Is there anything else with respect to revenue? I had a couple of comments about expenditures I wanted to cover, and then I'm done. And I did want to allow some time for questions. Yeah, Deb.
Revenue on the NKN excise tax, is that a Neoconi excise tax?
Mm-hmm.
And it was previously $6,136 and estimated it's $969 this year. I just was curious what that encompasses.
Yeah, I don't know if you can answer this one more easily than I can. It's hold on. Sorry, I have to my filing cabinet in my brain can only hold on to so much.
That one is definitely lower for this year because of the reduced building permits that we've issued. So that's just a small percentage.
Yes. Okay,
that we keep. So on every building permit, they give us a check that we remit directly to the NKN excise. It's not reflected in the budget at all. And then we keep a small portion.
Okay. Thank you, Nina.
Mm-hmm.
Who's they?
Nina?
Who is they?
Anyone who's getting a building permit.
And it just happens to have the name Neoconi.
Well, so a portion goes directly to the Neoconi School District, and then we retain a small portion on behalf of that.
It's a construction excise tax.
All right. God, for some reason I was thinking it's the Neoconi Water District, but thank you.
Yeah. School district is the key thing. Thanks.
Yeah, school district. Go Pirates. Okay, let me, I don't want to, did anybody have any other questions before I move on? Okay, and also know if something comes to mind, you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm happy to, I want you all to walk into the budget process really prepared. So I'm hoping that this has been helpful for you on that. In terms of expenditures, so council approved our salary resolution. Just a note, there was a job, one of the jobs got cut off on the bottom of the resolution. So I'm going to be asking you to reapprove that by consent so that the senior utility worker job is actually listed on the resolution. I just noticed it when I printed it out. It was like, where's the senior utility worker? And it was the bot. Anyway, but you approved that. It's a 6% increase for COLA. We did see a modest increase in healthcare. We did add in orthodontics this year, which wasn't a significant cost, but a significant benefit for a number of folks who both want and have children with orthodontics. And it's something that staff have been asking for. And we felt that that was a reasonable ask. And then we are also asking that the city, I didn't realize that we were able to do this last fiscal year, or else I would have proposed it, but to cover the new Family Medical Leave Act, which I think is, Nina, 0.006%. It doesn't add a huge amount, but it's just a nice, modest benefit for staff. So the personnel services and the benefits do include those assumptions. We did see an increase in PERS. So PERS increases, we get those increases every other year. And so this was the year for that. Some were significant, but not something that made your stomach drop. It was like, okay, we kind of anticipated. Oh, I'm sorry. So that's a public employee retirement system. So it's the essentially the pension system for public employees. And the city of Manzanita covers both the employee portion and the employer portion of that. We have 2 staff that are in tier 1, which is the golden handcuffs. And then the remainder of us are in what they call OPSERV. And so it's a much cheaper rate effectively. And police have a different retirement system. So it's somewhere in between tier 1 and call bottom tier. That's what I call what the rest of us are in. Materials and services. So we're adjusting for inflation, obviously. But one of the other things I've been working with staff on too is trying to get a higher level of accuracy of actual expenditures. I do like for us to overestimate to some extent, but I think that we were really overestimating. And a lot of that came from the way that the city had previously done budgeting prior to adopting a policy reserve for the general fund. So sort of a protectionary measure where we would really underestimate revenue and really overestimate expenditures so that we always ended the year with an ending fund balance that was like a surprise. We still, we're conservative in our estimates, but we are trying to get more accurate. So for example, Nina keeps pretty detailed spreadsheets of all of our dues and services and all of our, expenditures on equipment. And so we're able to make more informed estimates about that. We did see insurance increases for property and liability. So those are reflected in all the departmental budgets. And I do expect to see greater requirements for IT services because we're moving into in-person meetings. So that means I'm going to have to do a procurement process for that. But I made sure that the budget reflects what I anticipate those increases are. And then we'll see some capital improvements. An example is the transfer from the general fund into the public safety fund is going up for the first time in many years, and that's to account for inflation. And then just, finally, I'll have a 5-year projection for the council, and we'll be, I'll go through the details on that, but we will be obviously accounting for, inflation for materials and services, personnel services, and capital, so that we can provide you again with just a good projection for you to make an informed decision about the future. One thing I will note too is that we are aligning the capital expenditures with our capital improvement plan. So as part of the budget, we will be including the CIP, and the CIP really includes projects that we think we can complete over the next 5 years from a capacity standpoint. However, there will be certainly some funding gaps in that. And so we will be showing kind of what we think we can complete in this coming fiscal year. And so some of those capital expenditures, which were mostly like kind of a best guess before, are actually going to be founded and connected to projects in the capital improvement plan. And my goal is to leave the rest undesignated so that over the next year, the city council can review that 5-year capital plan and start to think about the revenue choices that we have in terms of finding revenue for these infrastructure projects, and to help staff further prioritize and find sources of funding to pay for those. So the capital projects that we'll be putting forward are based on, Dan has gone through and we have gone through in depth kind of what are necessary projects to be completed. One of the things from my understanding from talking with Dan is that the city typically just took one project on, soup to nuts at a time. We're taking a bit of a different tack and looking at projects that we can start design phases on now, because I think as you're learning through perhaps the City Hall project, when we get down the line in design, we get a far better understanding of what actual costs are. And so we'll be proposing to do some design work on projects that we maybe can't afford today, but will allow us to better understand how we can implement those projects. But next year, we'll be completing Dorcas if it doesn't get completed this fiscal year, and our focus will be on maintenance and early design on a couple of capital projects. And then, of course, when we start these, more telling Dan, we expect to have 3 to 4 work sessions with the city council over the next budget year to look at those projects, 5-year projects and the 10-year list, to get your feedback, guidance, and direction on next year's CIP. So that will also be included as an addendum to the budget, but just know that the capital expenditures that are within any of those funds are tied to the CIP. And I left you with 0 minutes for questions, but if you're willing to stay on, I'm happy to answer any you might have. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well,
hopefully you feel a little prepared to start.
Yeah, speak now or forever. Well, no.
You can always talk to us.
Does anybody have any other questions they want to bring forth? I think there's been a remarkable couple of hours to just to go over all the details on where we are and understanding the budgeting process. So for the obviously Kit, the new person, but the rest of us who can forget over the year, and any people who are watching on the, I guess on the live stream. So any last chance? Okay.
I have a question, which is, when do you expect?
You muted yourself right when you got to the good part.
Who was that?
That was Jim.
Chip.
Jim Doc.
No, was it Chip?
Oh, it's Chip.
All I heard was I
Do I have to admit? Well, I just like to know when you think you're going to send us the budget, and I assume you'll give us the option in the past of a hard copy. And
yeah,
I think let us know, because it's helpful to have both a hard copy and digital.
Yeah. So Oregon budget law. So again, one of the things I knew this last year, but every year we learn something new. We can't post the budget publicly until the budget message is delivered, which is May 8th. But I'd like to just, we need to have hard copies ready in advance of that. So if I could just see a show of hands of folks that would like a hard copy. All right. So I will reach out to all of you and make sure that you get those in time for you to have an opportunity to look at it, and then it will be posted publicly on the 8th.
Cool. And that,
Next year, my hope is to split up the budget message and the first budget hearing so that I can give it to you a week in advance. But I will reach out and let you know when your copy is ready.
Yeah. Thank you. And then there'd be the big rush down to City Hall. Anybody have anything
Dan
else?
had a question.
I just wanted to say, this was a easy to understand presentation. I can't imagine the hours that went into pulling it all together. It was nice to have it beforehand so that we could really go through and do our homework. So kudos to you and Nina both, and thank you for pulling all this together. Well done.
Thank you. I'm glad it's helpful.
Here, here.
Great.
Okay, with that, the next time we meet will be on Monday, May 8th at 4 o'clock. And until then, have a nice springtime, whatever we're going to get. So with that, I declare this meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.